All right, hey guys, Spam here, and welcome to Coach's Corner. Today we're going to be talking about theory versus practical play. And also, for those who have any more questions, go ahead and check us out on Discord. You can join Discord Plus and be a member to ask us even more phenomenal questions on anything related to platform fighters. All right, and today I'm excited. Of course, I'm joined by the GOATs as always. We got Ramses, we got, of course, Tony. How you guys doing today?
I'm good. Happy to be here. When we talk about theoretical characters, the Shulk main has to make an appearance.
Of course.
I'm eating myself sick for Thanksgiving, like an American.
Ah, yes, good Americans.
I do my best.
Yeah, so I mean, this topic is always interesting to me because I always love to, like, for any platform fighter, honestly any game, but especially for platform fighters, I love to go ham in the lab. And I am someone who loves to see players who are able to take the theory crafting and make it a reality. But like someone who is consistently in the lab, who loves to talk with a lot of labbers, you will see that it's easier said than done, right? Long and short of it. There's a lot of times when a lot of people will build out things, and whether it's like different particular strategies, certain combo routes, 50/50s, maybe some ways on how to strategize around ledge trapping, all those kind of things. And a lot of some of this stuff gets lost in terms of how it can actually be practical, because people who tend to be really great labbers and people who are also just really good at the practical, just playing the game, they're usually not, those aspects are usually not found in the same person, right? A lot of times it like takes a collaborative effort, or it takes a unique individual. Like, for example, someone I would say who's kind of does have that kind of mindset would be like Void, right? Someone who's like going to be able to lab, but they're also going to be able to see the nuance and see what is actually like practical versus something that is super, like it's way too situational to actually be relevant and be something that you should be focusing your time in. So I'm actually really excited to hear from you guys on this one, because I think that you guys both are like, I know Tony really loves to go into like the practicality with a lot of players, right? And that's something that he's always pushing forward. Obviously, Ramses, like, you're someone who loves the theoretical, but you're also someone who's like brought theoretical stuff into actual practice, right? In your gameplay. And I know that you coach people to do the same. So starting off with you, Ramses, like, where do you see the common pitfalls for a lot of people in terms of how these things transition, both as people and then also kind of like just tech in particular for like Ultimate?
Yeah. So I think the issue we have with Smash is that, like, culturally, the game doesn't like culturally, like the environment doesn't really support theoretical play. I think what you find in Smash is that most people just kind of play the game by intuition, especially in the more active scenes. And I'm talking here specifically about the US scene and France, who are two of the more active Western scenes, where you see like there's a lot of focus on grinding the game, spending as many hours, and what often happens is that people kind of naturally kind of prefer to just spend as much time as possible and really focus on essentially the things that come the most intuitively to you. And so what you see is that in terms of theoretical understanding, in terms of even like low-hanging fruits theoretically, a lot of strategy is kind of left to the wayside. Because so what is strategy, right? Like, how do we define like strategy? I think at TLDR, to have strategy, you need to have like resources that you're spending or choosing, like you're using them in specific ways that create long-term consequences, right? And so oftentimes that's not very intuitive, because like if I don't know, if you're like your local, like, number 5 on the PR pre-COVID, and Leo shows up to your local and he destroys you, how dominant he was before COVID, right? And he like reads all your jumps and he stops you from getting out of the corner, etc., etc. It's hard for a game that is as fast as Ultimate. It's hard to reflect on like the long-term ramifications of your short-term options. Like, you'll roll out of the corner, he'll hit you, and a lot of people, the takeaway will be, I should not roll out of the corner, right? Whereas in reality, like what's happening is like, okay, well, he is deciding to not directly pressure you, to instead use that time to set up pressure on a possible reversal. Like, it's more complex, but TLDR.
Mhm.
And so there's a strategic choice here that Leo is making, right? He's saying, I should not aggress on you now. I'm going to use this time to set up a stronger situation in the future. And so there's time that's being used there. There's space that's being used there. There's information that's being used there. Like all of these resources that we have that we're choosing to spend or not to spend, right? Choosing to act on or not to act on. And oftentimes the way that this kind of snowballs throughout the game is pretty hard to figure out. It's pretty unintuitive. And we see this in a lot of more like pure strategy games. If you think about, so an example could be like Slay the Spire. I don't know if you guys know Slay the Spire is like one of the best roguelikes ever made. Very strategical game. A lot of choices that have long-term ramifications because you're building like a deck, right? And I spent a lot of time on Slay the Spire. I've introduced a lot of friends to Slay the Spire, and they always say the same thing. It's like, I don't understand what my choice right now is doing for a possible future, because like I'm just like it's very abstract, it's very unintuitive, it's very obfuscated. It's stuff that you kind of have to reflect on, that you have to like pause and rewind to. And so kind of pulling it back to Smash, what we're seeing is a similar effect where, because people are so focused on essentially solving the problem in front of them, they lose track on the long term of the play. And so in that sense, for most people, the lack of theory is mostly just in terms of not understanding on like a conceptual level what their short-term actions, how the way that they're spending resources right now, what ramifications that has for the future. And I think for most people, right, like that is the main pitfall. The main pitfall is that they don't even bother, right? Like they're so focused on just continuously solving the problem in front of them that they don't reflect to kind of figure out, okay, so what's actually going on? What are the themes here? What are the like when I let's say, okay, if I jump out of this disadvantaged situation, of course I'm not going to get hit, but that might mean that you put yourself in a situation afterwards where you might die, right? Because now you don't have a jump to help yourself.
Yeah.
And so, that's a very, very abstract example, but that's often what it comes down to, is that people just don't really reflect on that. They don't really take the effort to kind of understand that. And so that's the main pitfall, in my opinion, is that people don't really bother. And so for the people that do bother, the biggest pitfall for them is often the opposite, where they focus so much on what could be that they're not really focusing on what's in front of them. And that's what makes the game hard. It's like, the game, like we're counting 1/60th of a second, and like that is the scale that we're playing the game at, in bits of 1/60th of a second. If something, again, I've said this before on this podcast, if something is 10 frames is slow, that's 1/6 of a second. That's not slow, that's fast as hell, dude. Like I can hardly count seconds. Well, I mean, I'm European, Anyway. I'm just saying words. Words
you are.
No, but like you get what I mean. Yeah, no, we use metric time. I'm sorry, guys. Like 60 seconds.
I'm a
60
fool.
seconds. We have 100 seconds per minute. Come on, guys, get with the fucking times. The metric times. No, weak. I've never seen an American count to 100 seconds. That's all I'm saying.
True.
Who's the weak one here?
True.
I say 99. You guys will probably you probably cry. Holy shit!
I'm breaking down.
That's more than 60. Anyway,
yeah.
No, but the point is like just counting to a single second already. Like it's even hard to keep up with that, right? Like if someone's counting rapidly, like this sounds so stupid, but I hope you get what I mean. The
Yes.
point is, 1 second is a very small unit of time, but within the context of Smash, it is a very large unit of time. And so what we essentially see is that because the game is so fast, it's hard to constantly be aware of the long-term ramification of what you're doing. And so a lot of the time, to get to the point where your theoretical play is stronger, you have to reflect and you have to essentially have these answers sort of pre-packaged, where you say, hey, when I'm in the corner, I'm going to focus a lot on, let's say, for example, the moment that they aggress on me, right? And the reason why I do so is because I know, like, strategically, in terms of long term, their highest value option is to actually wait for me to come forward, which is generally true. And so if their highest value option for them to wait for me, I'm going to try to pull them into picking the lower value option. And so I can still play extremely in the moment, just knowing, like, kind of factoring in that is what I'm focusing on. And that is how you should be structuring your play, is with these sort of heuristics, right? Heuristics, essentially shortcuts, where you're kind of involving these long-term decisions in that heuristic, but you're giving yourself the room to make these short-term decisions. And that is something that you don't see a lot from players, because again, it's so unintuitive. And so I think for most people listening, your first step is generally going to be like, okay, well, long term, what are my short-term choices doing for me? In terms of like the general meta that we're looking at, I think the biggest thing that we're missing is, well, I mean, it's going to obviously be extremely different between like top level and like, you know, like typically top level and like, you know, the higher end of high level, like there's user differences here. But I still feel like for most of the population, you don't really see people even have multiple strategies in the first place. And what we're even seeing at like top level, and this is a difference between, in my opinion, top and like top level, what we're seeing a lot at top level is that people are still not implementing specifics, right? So think about even something like a foot start of shield, or using specific positions in very specific matchups to improve, for example, a left trap situation. What we generally see, even at top level, is more generic solutions so that people can fully focus on playing the quote-unquote fundy play style, right? Like essentially playing what generically applies to every matchup. Because that is usually enough, right? Because if your opponent doesn't get into specifics, then generally you don't need that to succeed. You can out funny them. Whereas if they are on that fundy's life and they're getting into specifics, then well, that of course sets the bar higher. And so we look at, for example, especially a Sonics, and I know Tony can tell us more about that. I think Sonics is really, really great at going into the specifics of every matchup and adjusting to that. I think Spargo is good at doing that too. But even if we look at someone like Spargo, who I think is current season's strongest player in the world, right? When I saw him play against Hurt, even there were moments where we saw Spargo trying to kind of force his own plan onto Hurt. And in that case, it makes sense, right? Just to see if it would succeed. But again, like in a theoretical world, we're just kind of going for the optimal choices. And because like, why even test if I can get away with something lazy if I know that the optimal choice is generally like the highest expected value? But we're in a world where your opponent might not be ready for you, right? Like your opponent might not be prepared, and so you might as well check to see if they are or are not. And so like, I'm not here to tell you that that was like a bad choice by Spargo to test that. What I am saying is that it is a symptom of a metagame that is not entirely developed yet, which is fair. Like a metagame will not always be 100% developed, but I do think we are lagging behind more than, for example, a more traditional fighter would be, because again, traditional fighters are all about labbing. Lab out situation A, lab out situation B, get these specifics in row, right? Like if your I don't know, like if your Guilty Gear weight is different, then I'm gonna do a different combo that leads to different Oki that gives me like an extra frame of advantage. It lets me do a different trap instead of going for my generic Oki. And of course, the systems are more closed, and so it's easier to get into the specifics, right? Because there's less varied situations than in Smash. But we're still, in my opinion, a little bit lazy on that regard. And I just think it's there's a lot of low-hanging fruits there. So lots of different things that I talked about, but I think it all kind of falls under the same umbrella. What do you think, Tony?
So, first I want to say is that I think that people tend to use theory as a word that can refer to multiple different concepts. So, I think that most commonly what people are actually referring to when they describe theory or use the word theory is structure. And I think this is actually probably one of the more practical uses of theory is how am I going to structure my thoughts? How am I going to structure my play? And because that's not something you do with a controller in hand, I think people tend to view that as theory. And that could be correct. I actually don't know. But I think that tends to be what people are referring to. But when I think of what the word theoretical tends to actually be referring to, I tend to think of things that are above, or rather pushing the boundaries of what is used in practice, and things that can exclusively be explored through concept. Because the ability to execute them, whether that's physical limitations, execution, etc., these are the things that I think people tend to think of. Oh, well, that's a theory play, And so I think that in practice, that tends to be more of just a prototypical play or something that's more experimental, where we're not sure if it'll work or not until we can actually satisfy certain contexts that will allow us to experiment with it. I think that more commonly, though, is you get theory fighters or theory players where they have an idea, or again, going back to there being a structure, but because their structure and their mind or their theory of the game is rational and coherent to them as a player, because the game makes sense to me, that is the game. In practice, I think that usually what happens is that is not the game, and I think this is where you'll see a lot of players get frustrated because they'll see someone who is they consider dumber or less thoughtful than them going through and outperforming them with what is clearly a less thought through or less considered form of play. And so what they will see there is that their theory is not holding up to big dumb off just pressing buttons. And so what they'll then say is, well, if the theory is not paying off here, then this game does not reward theory. When in practice, I think that usually what that really means is that you and your structure is not actually covering or encompassing the entire game. You have seen a small piece of the puzzle, and because that's all you can see, you mistake that for the actual borderland of what exists. Mm-hmm. And so I think that the game is very big, both Smash as a series and any individual Smash game is so improbably complex that I feel like I am very far from seeing even the edges or limitations of that as a person who has been studying the game for decades at this point. So I think the game tends to be very complicated. And so I think that when we are looking or theorizing on play and we're looking for structure, I think that, as Ramses said, because there's so many low-hanging fruits available, what we want to look for is not looking for the most optimal overall, but rather what is most efficient. So what we want to find is what is going to get me the most reward for the unit of time that I put in. So if I only had, let's say, 100 seconds to put into training mode, what is going to actually benefit me long term for investing in those 100 seconds? And that's where theory comes in. But here's a spoiler for you. If you have any number of things that you could practice off the top of your head, the time that you're spending actually practicing instead of thinking of what you should practice is probably better off spent doing so. Just do it. Just play. Just practice. Yeah. And even using the US and France as examples, players I help from both regions, some of the best players in the world, when I talk to them about what they should be doing, it is not, oh, well, we're going to just redevelop this character's metagame. It's, these are your basic things that you aren't getting this percentage of the time. Let's work on that and go back to the basics. But that's something I already practice. Well, then you need to practice it more, or we need to find a more efficient, more specific, as Ramses mentioned, way to practice. So that specificity is a matter of efficiency. Look at the 100 seconds you're practicing. How many of those hundreds of seconds were actually practicing the specific exercise, the specific mental muscle that you are activating when you are supposed to execute in practice? And usually what you're going to find is that you're spending a lot of time setting up, a lot of time considering it. But if you actually use a stopwatch to count it, you're going to find that you're spending very little time actually executing the specific exercise and improving your actual form or function. So what we want to do is we want to identify what the specifics are in terms of hierarchy, which is where the use of theory comes in. But then once you have identified those things, don't let your mind get away with you. You need to lock that back down. Thought time is over. You need to get to the doing. You need to get to the training and just focus on the routine of your own improvement. At that point, excessive thought is detracting from your ability to practice, not because it actually forbids you from doing so, but just because as an opportunity cost, it is time that you are not spending on the doing. So I think that there's a specific archetype of player I would actually refer to as a theory-based player. And I think that for those players on the overall time scale of their improvement lifetime, once they reach a certain level, they actually have to recover from their own theory. They actually have to reach a certain point of despair where they realize that the theory is just overcomplicating the game, not because it has to, but because they are, again, going back to the example I mentioned before, seeing these players who don't put in the same time, that same thought into them as they do, and getting similar or better results to them. Once you recover from, I guess you could just call that a traumatic realization that dumb people can do the same things, but they don't necessarily have to rationalize how they're going to do so. They can just do whatever makes sense in the moment, and it just so happens to be correct, even though there's no agency behind it. And so I think that it can take some time, just from personal experience of having seen these kinds of players recover from them and then go on to perform much better lifetime-wise. What we see them do, though, is usually they have to just get used to or relearn the game from a different perspective. And so you can kind of save yourself that headache if you realize, hey, this is where I'm at. I need to pull back. I've identified enough low-hanging exercises to reach these delicious fruits, and I just need to keep plucking until I'm not seeing performance increases. In the meantime, if you're still seeing performance improvement, if you still feel like you're getting better, if you're over large periods of time seeing your results improve and work toward your goals, keep let it rock. Just keep reaping the benefits of the training that you're putting in. In the meantime, if you do hit a plateau, then the question now is, am I doing everything that I think I should be doing? Or if not, this is now the time for theory again. We need to think about what boundaries of what I see in the game is there, and what could I push. And if I'm not sure, that's when you seek out counsel, seek coaching, try and reach out and push your boundaries. And then once you have identified new low-hanging fruits to grab for, spend your days going picking for berries. There you go. Have a great time.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Go for it.
Tony, you were talking about how people sometimes overcomplicate their game. And so how do you look at overcomplication in general?
So I'll actually use a specific example of a player who has been reaching out to me, has been very thoughtful, asks complicated questions, asks specific questions, and they're always looking to expand on these. So once they have an answer, they then ask themselves, well, this is another way that could expand. Could you please elucidate me on that? Could you please explain this? And I finally told them one day that nothing I tell them is going to be helpful. In fact, the more I tell them, the more toxic it is actually going to be to their own improvement, because the time that they're spending thinking is time that they're not spending doing very basic things, because they needed to practice doing things like down tilt to up smash, not thinking about, well, what if my opponent already knows what I'm going to do? That doesn't matter, because you're not doing anything. You cannot do anything. You lack the roots, the foundation to do anything. It's not possible for you to win before you can win. So before you go looking for layer 2 of Yomi, you should probably be able to execute layer 1.
Right.
And then, sure enough, once this person had been practicing consistently, we went through what they're going to be practicing. Before they had even made it through their first week of training, they're trying to overcomplicate their own training routine. They're saying, oh, maybe I should triple the number of exercises I'm running in my training routine. And so I asked them, have you been practicing every single day for a week straight yet? No. Focus on implementing your consistency before increasing complexity. So, week 2, we increase the intensity of the specific exercises that they're working on. They wanted to increase the complexity, and I told them no. Now, maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But as far as what I told them to record, what I want them to do, I want them to keep it to within the specification that I have already given them. Do not make it more complex than you have to unless you are already being consistent. And this goes from bottom to top. I don't care if you're a new player or if you are considered one of the best players in the world, because speaking of Sonics, this is a conversation I've had with him as well, where we have just said, you do not need to make more complex scenarios. We still have specific scenarios. These are the percentage success rates you are getting in these scenarios. These are the best. They can be better. Keep working and keep seeing the improvements on the established training that you are already executing on a regular basis, and maintain your consistency, because consistency is a multiplier to time in which you give that consistency. The greater the time span that you are executing that consistency, the more valuable it becomes. But if you don't have that consistency in the first place, then don't talk to me about complexity. I don't care. It's not effective. It's probably a waste of your time. Just focus on the doing, and then it should be easy when you're starting out. Things like training this is Smash Brothers. This is not life and death. You are not going to be fighting for your life to go through your training mode routine. And if you think you are doing so, that is not sustainable. Mm-hmm. A key feature to consistency is sustainability. Because if that time span times consistency is a relevant figure, which maybe it's not, my theory on training is incorrect, then in the meantime, what we want sustainability in order to increase that unit of time until you hit burnout, which ideally should not actually happen. But also, you don't want to have such a low intensity on your training that you never come close to your burnout either. So we do still want to increase intensity, but only in line with keeping that consistency. This is a matter of training volume, and this applies to any form of training, whether it's physical, mental, emotional, it doesn't matter. You don't want to push too far past what you can maintain, but you do want to maintain, and you do want to progress the intensity of that maintenance.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, I think it's good that you talk about over-complication, because this is a big one. I try to tell anyone I ever have conversations with. One of the words I hate, like the term overthinking, pisses me off to no end. Yes. I hate it. I despise it with every sense of my being. And one of the big reasons why I hate it is because there's a certain, like, when someone says that to me, right, there's a certain level of audacity that's there as well, where I think that, like, the thing that it's like, oh, I'm overthinking. It's just, oh, my brain was just too big for this moment. I'm sorry. I wish I could just be dumb like you fools. No, that's stupid. When someone says that to me, that means you cannot properly prioritize what actually matters, right? And what happens is when people say they're overthinking, it's like, because it's like you said, you're thinking about, what if they know if I'm going to do this? Do I have to shift and shift? You can't even do a down tilt to up air. You can't even get the kill thing. Then no one's thinking about that. That's a waste of time, right? Like you said, there's no point of talking about, hey, what's up there? You can't even walk up the stairs, bro. You'll never be up on the second floor. There's no point talking about that, right? It's a waste of time. And that's what it comes to when people talk about like that overthinking. I think that's something that plagues a ton of people in the theory crafting space, people who love to kind of be in these things, these very specific hypothetical situations, right? And we see from so many aspects of life. I know, like Ramses, you already talked about it. Tony, you've been talking about it too, right? That consistency, right? That's so much more impactful than any of these things. I don't care if you can do this sick thing that can kill someone that's a 0 to death if you can only do it 1 out of 1,000 times. That is absolutely useless. Good job. You hit some one person with it. Now you are 1 and 2. Sick. Dope. Good job. Right? Good for you. But that's not going to create real change. All right. Real change happens over time. And in order to be able to rise to the occasion during these time periods, all these multitudes of presents, you need to be consistent, right? You need to be able to have that flow at that high octane. And so, yeah, it's like you guys were saying, it's very, very important to understand those things and not just get caught up in your own head, right? Because the thing is, you have to do, right? Thought is great as long as it's a precursor to action. If there's no action and you're just thinking all day just for the sake of thinking, then what are we really doing here, right? We're not moving forward anywhere, right? And it's really big for, like, a lot of people can get caught in that, especially too, like it's a very big thing for mid-level players, right? Because it's like you get this spot, you don't really know what you're doing, and then you get to the certain point where, like, your brain starts to expand. You start hearing about this stuff and all this crazy stuff, right? And that's a lot of times that's the stuff that sucks people in, right? And gets them really excited and they really want to play the game because, oh man, I didn't know you could do this and this, right? But that also is the death of a lot of players because then they get sucked into that plane and they never return. They never go back to doing. They just want to hear more about this. I can do this. I can fly this. Did you know you can do this? The amount of players I've heard yap all day in tournament to someone else and one of their friends tell them that all these like, oh yeah, I don't know if you knew this, but you can do this, blah, 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 blah. And then it's like, I see that person, and then that person goes back and sits in the crowd because they're already done. They're out. they lost already.
Did you know? Did you know that he could do this?
Yeah, the did you know masters, right? Like, and that's not to say there isn't any kind of knowledge there or part that may be like actually useful, right? But it's the bigger thing is that you cannot let that consume what is ultimately far more important, right? And the key things in that are going to allow you to be there to even have those discussions. And that's why a lot of those things, right? People will say, and that like, all these Twitter clips, right? All the people yapping about Twitter clips, and it's like, yeah, these Twitter clips are never going to see the actual light of day in a tournament because a lot of people just get stuck and transfixed on these specific situations and the glory that comes from them. And I get it. It's beautiful. Like, it's sick hitting someone with some crazy high level tech no one's seen before. And like, it's great. It's a wonderful euphoria, but man, it could be a hell of a drug. And a lot of times players do not recover from that. And they're just sitting there addicted to that one peak moment. And in their head, what they tell themselves is go, you see that? That was me playing for real. All those other times, I made mistakes, whatever. But that moment right there, that
was the real me.
That was me. Everything else, that's not real. It's not real, right? And like, that kills a lot of players' careers, man. And a lot of people in life, man. A lot of people like, same thing, man. I'll see it with weekend ballers too. I go out and go out the ball and have a good time, and then that person will finally hit their Steph Curry shot. Half court, they finally hit it after 6 games of losing every damn game, and they hit that one shot, and they're like, "Oh, there's my shot, man. I don't know, man. It just wasn't hitting today." It's like, all right, bro, you got it. So don't be that guy. Don't be that guy.
I think to jump on off of that, because I think that's a really good point. I think what people are missing is like a purpose for the theory, right? Because like, when I look at like my local, I don't know, like Gettendorf theory crafter, there's no local Dutch Gettendorf theory crafter, but you know the guy plays like this low mid tier, and like if you're at 61.3% and 55 pixels away from the ledge on Smashville at 7 p.m. at your you know what I mean? Like the thing is like, what is the purpose of theory? And I think at the end of the day, what are we trying to do? We're trying to win, but the best of the best doesn't just win, they win consistently. And so how do you win consistently? It's by controlling as many situations, as many variables as you can. And so the end goal of theory, it is to put you in a position where you can control as much as possible, as much as in as wide of a array of situations and circumstances as possible, but also as much as in as intensely as possible, right? Like that is the end goal of the game. And I think if we look at why generally top level players are not very theoretically inclined, it's because, as Tony said, the best way to control something is by acting on it. And so the game kind of selects for people who grind, who just put in the hours, and who just intuitively just get really good at pressing the buttons. And then what you see is that the top level players, they get to the top and then they kind of like hit the roadblock, and then they start diving deeper into like the actual understanding behind the game, more so than the other way around. Because like Tony said, right, like being able to control something poorly is better than not being able to control it at all, right? Like, so step one is to actually be able to press the button. And then we can go into pressing the button good. And so like for me, and a big cornerstone for my coaching, whenever I talk to people, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get you to a position where you can make a choice. And it doesn't really matter what the choice is, as long as you understand, like, okay, well, these are the things I can do. Because when you have a choice, you can start to control something. Because if you are acting on a situation in the same way every single time, then like who decides whether you get hit or not? Well, it's up to the opponent. If they can figure it out, they'll hit you, and if they can, they won't hit you, right? And so who's in control there? Well, practically the opponent. Oftentimes, like if the way you execute on it is very like clean, of course it can get harder, and you can there's a lot of gray area there. But the TLDR is like we got to put ourselves in a position to make choices, right? And whether that choice is as simple as like I'm gonna decide to corner pressure here in with direct pressure, and I'm gonna decide to corner pressure here by playing more delayed, right? Like these are very basic things, and like just telling someone who plays super intuitively, like, oh, you know what? Sometimes you should corner pressure by going in directly, and sometimes you should corner pressure by waiting for them, and like figure out when to use which. Like just advice like that already does a lot for people who play super intuitively. But the like if you want to get to like a really high level, you have to like understand the specifics and blah blah. Anyway, the point is, if you're at a place where you can make choices, that is from there you can start to control things. And so I think similarly, when Tony talks about overcomplication, I don't really like the terms overthinking and overcomplicating, not because of what Bam said, but mostly because I feel like people use it as sort of like and I know this is like sort of pretentious to say, but I think it's a bit of an anti-intellectualism kind of thing where it's like, oh, dude, that guy is overcomplicating. I just pressed a good button, right? Like I minecart because it's good, bro. And like it's cool to not care and not think, right? But the way I think about it, it's like you cannot really overthink something because like either there's more to think about, in which case like you don't fully understand it yet, or you're at a point where you understand, like you know where you're at, and you can kind of go from there. And so I feel like if someone is overthinking something, what does that show? That shows that there are elements of that situation that they don't understand. And so they are spending time thinking about it. It's just that the thinking isn't going anywhere because like, they're not approaching it from the right perspective. Anyway, the point I was trying to make is that a lot of people, the reason why they overcomplicate things is because they struggle to make a choice. The reason why someone is like, oh, should I practice this way? Or like, I'm not going to practice until I have the perfect kind of like practice regime set up. The reason it gets to that point is because they cannot make a choice. And so like, the best thing you can do for your own sake, the best thing you can do to get to like a high theoretical level of play is to make as many choices as possible. And so why are we not at a point where we can make like these, like, why do I think we're not at a point where Ultimate is living up to its potential, right? Like the theoretical potential of what Ultimate could be. I think the TLDR is that there are so many choices that people are still busy optimizing these, like not super endgame choices. And so there's like why go into like the super endgame choices when there's still, as Tony has said before, when there's still low hanging fruit. And so relatively speaking, of course, like like the low hanging fruit again for Sonics is gonna like for you little like 2-2 or at your local, like that is like he's like a fucking giraffe. Like the fruit does not hang low for you, but for him like the comparison is like like there's a huge difference there. And so the point is for most people. If you're ever at a point where you don't know how to solve something, try to introduce a choice, right? Go from there. And that is where theory can be really powerful because like, how do you identify a choice? Well, again, the game is too fast to do it in a moment, like I said before. And so to identify choices, oftentimes that's where you're diving into theory. And like Tony said, that's where you're introducing structure. And the structure is essentially, what am I looking for? Like, where am I building towards? And not just like, the long-term ramifications, but also just like the choices you have, right? Like, it's not like, it's not like you're always building towards the same thing, right? It's a good place to start, right? Again, like Tony said, like if you're at a point where you don't have the capacity to press the buttons, you don't even have, like, in other words, if you don't have a hammer and you don't have a screwdriver, you cannot choose between them. So step one is like make a hammer, and then like make it really, really good. And then step two is to make a screwdriver, and then both make it good and learn to use the right one in the right situation. Right, and so there's like a phase where you're developing a tool, and then there's a phase where you're learning to use it in the right situation. But yeah, and so like when I look at top level play, I think there's a lot more tools to be developed, and I think there's a lot more choices to be made between the established tools that are currently not being made, and I think that's fine. I don't think that shows that these players are like, I don't think that says anything about the players. I think it just says something about the sheer amount of knowledge that you have to gain to play Ultimate at a high level, because there's 90 characters and 20,000 different metas and a million different playstyles, and like, especially if you're something like a Spargo or Sonics or a Tweak or a like any player who's like leading the meta game, you cannot take any choices from someone else. Well, you can to some degree, but like there's going to be a lot of nuance there. And so you're going to have to develop that hammer without knowing what a hammer should look like, which is like, that's really hard. Like, how do you develop a tool when you don't know exactly what the tool is going to look like? It's like you have a puzzle and you know there's like a few missing pieces. And so you start developing a piece, but like you don't know exactly how it should look. Maybe it should be 2 pieces, right? You just know the vague shape. And so you're going to make something that approximates the shape, and then you're going to try it out, and you're going to have to refine. It's just a lot of work. That's the TLDR. And so like, it's to me, it doesn't mean anything. Outside of the fact that it's hard. Ultimate is a very, very hard game where you're making very long-term decisions in very short-term situations. And the only way you can get to do that is to zoom out. And the best way to zoom out is to not try to develop these things in the moment, but to instead look back with the power of hindsight.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, Tony, I mean, I know we some last few thoughts here, but you go ahead, Tony.
Oh, please continue.
No. I want you to. You're good.
I insist.
Okay, all right. Fine. Yeah, this last thoughts for me. Again, I think that kind of saying a similar thing there to like Ramses, like about the overcomplication and the like overthinking. Like if that means that there's more to be had there, and you're actually missing out on things, right? There's because if you understood the totality of what's going on, which no one ever is going to, there's always going to be like it's the amount of like information needed to do so you're not going to have, right? So a lot of times when you're doing that, like what you're really saying is, again, you're too transfixed on a piece of the puzzle. Exactly. And so that's why you think it's overthinking, and it's not working out that way. So instead, what you should be seeing when that happens, instead of calling it overthinking, it's like, be like, oh, I'm thinking too, like I'm that means that I'm thinking about this wrong thing. There's something else that's missing from this here, right? This whole aspect and whole viewpoint that I have here, it's too narrow. Because something else is happening that's showcasing to me that I'm missing something here, right? And I need to expand and zoom out and really look at things and reprioritize things, right? And I think that's a big thing that a lot of people need to continue to work on and improve upon so they can get to that next step, right? And towards that fruit analogy, like you were talking about, like, yeah, because no matter where you are, most players, right? Honestly, I think just for all of us, right? There's going to be the low-hanging fruit, right? And there's always going to be there's always going to be some high level of fruit, right? Unless you have mastered the totality of all things that are ultimate or life or whatever, right? Most of the time, there's going to be those fruits there, right? And a lot of times it is just people want to look up. You want the glory and the greatness, and you want to chase off there. Just deal with what's in front of you, all right? You got to do that. And a lot of times, the best in the world at anything is because they deal with what's in front of them, right? And like, again, this is stuff that is transferable in life, right? Steph Curry isn't sitting around even though he can do these shots, he's not sitting around throwing going around like, all right, here we go. I'm going to throw this ball all the way over. Like, Steph Curry's still practicing layups. Steph Curry's still practicing the three, that same shot in that same corner over and over and over and over and over and over again. And then when he's tired, he's doing it again and again. Right. And that's how you get to the point where you can do those things at that level and the consistency no one even imagined would be happening. Right. In terms of the 3-point shot. Right. And that's how you get there. Right. It starts with this thing, consistency over and over and over and over again. Right. You see some of the best in the world doing this crazy stuff. They're not practicing that crazy layup that you saw in the highlight all day. They're practicing their regular damn layups 1 billion times. That's what they're doing. Right. And that's what leads you there. Right. Because you want to get the low hanging fruit. You get the low hanging fruit. You eat, you grow, you get bigger. And guess what? Then there's going to be higher fruit that now is the low hanging fruit. You eat, you grow, you get bigger. And now you get that fruit again. Right. But it's the process of getting there. Because if you're just jumping all day for this high fruit and you can never get it, guess what? You're not eating. You're hungry, you're starving, you're dead. You didn't grow. All right. Game over.
You're in the audience.
You're in the audience. All right. You're in the audience telling someone, well, I would have hit that.
He could have done something else.
That's what you're doing. And that's not doing anything for anybody. But anyways, Tony, you go ahead. Closing thoughts.
I wanted to say, I don't want to come across as too harsh on theory crafters. I think that a way to view it productively is a separate skill or adjacent hobby to actual competitive Smash. in which it's very enjoyable. People who enjoy it tend to enjoy the other thing as well, and so there's a lot of crossover. But it's like having a pen. Whether you are a writer or a carpenter, a pen is a necessary tool for your work, but the degree of importance of that pen is going to be much more substantial for, say, a commentator or a coach like we are, versus how useful it is to the carpenter, who still needs to have it within their repertoire, but that carpenter is still doing the bulk of their work without it. And so it's just another tool in their toolkit. It is not a central tool in the way it is for someone like us, where that is partially why we are so useful for, say, our fellow carpenters, because we do an awful lot of writing. We've done an awful lot of writing in order to improve that skill up to this point. It is a unique skill that is less central to the skill set of competing Smash player versus Smash, us who are in the audience. So, as an audience member here and a person who was a very dead theory player and who has learned the game and learned that I actually don't know that much about the game many times, I assure you there is a lot to learn about the game, and it's not always necessarily competitively relevant stuff either. Or maybe it's competitively relevant, but for off-meta characters that don't have players. So, an example for this would be there's a certain high-level melee player who was considering getting into Ultimate, and they wanted to do so with a character that I actually think is very, we'll say, underrepresented. And they are a hardworking player, and they asked me about it, and I told them, don't bother. It's probably not worth it for the amount of time that it would require you to put into it when what you're already doing, what you already have available to you is in the game. Just because the amount of time that you would need to commit to that would require this to become your main hobby for a solid year before you start seeing the actual results. And if you, as a professional player, need to see those results within Ultimate as you make a transition, then this is not a character that's going to give you that in the first year. They would give you those results in the second year, though, and they would continue to escalate those results as time goes on. So unless you're willing to invest that amount of time into it to begin with, it's just not efficient enough to justify spending or investing that time into it. And so even if you can execute something at a top level, you need to understand that if you really aren't willing to have essentially a year of what feels like wasted time on your path to get there, that it is not worth it. And that is essentially what I think people tend to view as a real theoretical performances. I know that if someone were to spend 3 years into this character, it would get the same results as this other character that people already know is getting results. But the road to get there is not nearly as linear. Then it's probably not worth it unless you yourself are patient enough to accept being an O2er for several months on the way there. Like that just as an example. So I wanted to clarify. Theory is great. It's just a matter of who it's great for and understanding what you're getting when you're investing your time into it.
1,000%. 1,000%. Well, I think that about wraps it up for this episode. Hope you all enjoyed. Please like, follow, and subscribe. And let us know, are you mewing? What's happening? This guy, Ramses. I'm sorry, I know. But yeah, again, like, follow, subscribe, click that bell icon, show some love, and let us know, what other questions that you would love to be answered by us as we kind of move forward. But I hope you all enjoyed this episode. I had a good time talking to y'all, as always. But for now, class dismissed. See y'all soon.